By 1984, there were over 100,000 Unix systems running on everything from microprocessors to mainframes. Through organic growth and a strange quirk of history, Unix had come to deeply enmesh itself into the computer industry. But the result of that uncurated organic growth has been a sprawling ecosystem of unintelligible OSs, a babel of Unixes. Then suddenly, its creator, AT&T, decided to try and leverage this magnificent tool to make their way into the computer business. Those efforts were chaotic, to say the least. In this video, a chronicle of what we call the Unix Wars. In 1983, Novell broke up. Nearly a decade earlier, the United States government had sued AT&T once more over its production of telephone equipment for its telephone monopoly. In response, the company proposed that it relinquish that monopoly and break itself up. The breakup would end the 1956 consent decree that kept AT&T from selling computers. They had long wanted to offer what are known as, quote, enhanced services, end quote, communication services beyond just the simple transmission of data. They wanted to get involved in that data's content. As this breakup plan percolated, AT&T started to take steps towards making Unix a commercial venture. In 1975, Bell Labs produced the version 6 of Unix. It was the first version of Unix crafted with an eye for outside sale. AT&T started to sell commercial licenses for version 6 through its subsidiary Western Electric. They charged about $20,000 to run Unix on the first machine and another $8,000 for each additional one. The price apparently came about because the guy in charge of this at AT&T had real work to do, and so chose a number that he thought would be so high nobody would bother him about it. But people paid it, because Unix had found for itself a real market out there. Two major trends drove this commercial market for Unix products. First, you had programmers using the BSD Unix coding environment during their time in university. They enjoyed it and wanted to keep on using it after graduation. Ergo, Unix's strong point was in the engineering/scientific/technical applications space. Second, you had this market trend of cheap but powerful workstation computers hitting the market. Systems like those from Sun Microsystems, which positioned Unix at the heart of their systems. The first wave of companies servicing this need were porting houses, companies that simply changed Unix to run on another piece of hardware. Examples like Unisoft, Santa Cruz Operation, and so on. But over time, larger companies joined in. Companies like DEC, Data General, and even IBM started offering versions of Unix for their own hardware, often with changes made for their own differentiation. With Unix's creator AT&T largely out of the market, it ended up a huge mess. Despite sharing up to 90% of the code, applications written for one Unix variant cannot run on all the others. The community did not have a leader. Many of the variants were not allowed to call themselves Unix because AT&T owned the trademark, but it worked similarly to Unix. The whole thing confused users and the marketplace. A year before the AT&T breakup, Novell had combined their various versions of Unix into a single system, which they called Unix System 3. A few additional features, including a number from BSD, were then added to create System 5. This Unix product received its own division within AT&T, AT&T Information Systems, later Unix Systems Laboratories, or USL. System 5 was announced as a commercial product in January 1983 at the Unicom conference in San Diego. The licensing terms were a bit pricey, with a commercial license for the source code costing $43,000, more if you wanted add-ons. AT&T wanted to make their version of Unix, this System 5, the standard Unix operating system to be adopted by everyone. So in 1983, System 5 made up one major branch of the Unix tree with official backing from AT&T. The other branch was BSD Unix, which was then a significant player in the university market and the foundation for many commercial systems. That same year, the Computer Systems Research Group, which maintained BSD, released 4.2 BSD, which included popular extensions like TCP/IP Internet Networking. This struggle between System 5 and BSD makes up the first stage of the Unix wars. Users like hardware makers had to decide which of the two to adopt. Some, like IBM and Hewlett-Packard, decided to use the System 5 Unix, while others, like Sun, chose to extend BSD, namely the 4.2 variant that Bill Joy last worked on, for their Sun OS. And they were different. System 5 at the start did not support internet networking like 4.x BSD, nor did it have BSD's Berkeley Fast File System, which was seen as an improvement on the old file system, or the virtual memory system that made it so well suited for 32-bit VAX minicomputers. The struggle also pitted two different cultures. AT&T was seen as the evil big business, and the Berkeley people as the ragtag group of underdog rebels. The famous Mount Xenu posters reflected this culture. But since BSD Unix was ultimately just a few helpful extensions to existing AT&T code, people needed to first get a very pricey AT&T source license before using it. This became a big obstacle for BSD's commercial adoption. Throughout the 1980s, former BSD vendors and users switched over as System 5 adopted BSD's features. They might as well if they had to get an AT&T license anyway. The license requirements, along with AT&T's increasingly tight grip on them, had other repercussions. University professors previously had Unix content in their classes as a teaching tool for operating systems. This content was purged and became more theory-based. Textbooks, too, were under AT&T's control since they contained Unix source code. One famous such textbook was The Lion's Commentary on Unix, a cherished text. Eventually down the line, AT&T's grip will squeeze too tightly, but more on that later. On March 27, 1984, AT&T formally entered the computer business. They hit the market with a range of computers from desktop PCs to super mini computers, targeting customers producing their own applications. One of AT&T's key assets in that push would be Unix. An article at the time mentioned, AT&T for the past year has been pushing to have Unix adopted as an industry standard, and today it claimed that has been very successful. But AT&T's line of Unix computers struggled to gain widespread acceptance. Ordinary users found AT&T's Unix PCs hard to use compared to alternatives like MS-DOS on IBM PCs. And application developers found it hard to write software for Unix because of all the variants and the slight differences between them. Why not write for Microsoft with their more consistent and larger ecosystem? By 1985, MS-DOS had 5 times the number of applications than Unix. Without the applications, customers and users were shy to adopt AT&T's platforms, a chicken and egg situation. In 1986, AT&T took a $1.2 billion loss. Losses in the computer market comprised of about half of that. They laid off over 24,000 people, closed plants, offloaded some of the PC business to Olivetti, and shifted their strategy to selling computer systems for the telecommunications industry. If AT&T wanted Unix to turn around their computer business, then they had to unify this sprawling mess of a family tree. But how to do that? That is when Sun came knocking. In 1987, AT&T and Sun joined forces. Sun Microsystems was the largest Unix vendor, with their OS built on top of 4.2 BSD. They and AT&T felt that by combining their forces, they could unify the platform and build it into a formidable challenger. By October of that year, they had a deal. AT&T received an option to buy 20% in Sun and a seat on the board, and the two would merge together their versions of Unix, along with Microsoft's Xenix system, to create System 5 Release 4. So Sun would issue a new version of Sun OS with one based on this new release of Unix. Sun in turn would receive preferential treatment as AT&T built out the software. Sun and AT&T envisioned this new Unix as an, quote, open technical standard that anybody in the computing industry can use. AT&T apparently felt at the time that they needed Sun's marketing heft to complement their technical chops. But hardware vendors like DEC, IBM, and Hewlett-Packard panicked. Rival hardware makers used Unix as a foundation on which they can lay on their own features, making Unix a public utility, essentially. AT&T's move was alarming because it seemed like they were going to wipe away all of those value adds and impose their own standard. Not to mention that Sun was their direct competitor, and shortly before the AT&T announcement, Sun had just announced their own homegrown RISC microprocessor Spark. If Unix became a market standard and Unix was optimized to work best on Spark, then Sun gets a massive leg up on everyone. On January 1988, representatives of independent Unix ecosystem members like Apollo, DEC, Honeywell, Ball, and Hewlett-Packard began to talk about uniting in opposition to the Sun AT&T alliance. At first, they called themselves the Hamilton Group because they met at DEC's Western Research Laboratory on Hamilton Avenue in Palo Alto, California. First, they met with the man in charge of AT&T's computer efforts, Vittorio Cassoni, with little result. AT&T essentially told them to pound sand. So in May 1988, they invited IBM and together founded the Open Software Foundation, or OSF. OSF would pool its members' Unix variants and work towards the eventual release of an AT&T free Unix. On a more amusing note, OSF put together two hated rivals, DEC and IBM. At the OSF announcement, a Wall Street Journal reporter said that he and nobody else present had ever recalled DEC co-founder Ken Olsen ever sharing a stage with an IBM executive before. When Unix originator Ken Thompson heard about this whilst traveling in Australia, he turned to Dennis Ritchie and said, "Just think, IBM and DEC in one room, we did it." Sun's CEO, Scott McNealy, did not appreciate it as much. He called OSF the Oppose Sun Forever Foundation. Soon after this, Sun and AT&T founded Unix International, whose members also included Intel, Toshiba, Unisys, and Motorola. They agreed to build products around their version of Unix. Over the next few years, OSF and Unix International worked to fulfill their promises, signing up over 200 various members to their coalition. OSF co-opted much of Sun's open language, appealing to themes of liberty and justice to get the hype rolling. But OSF's reality struggled to meet their idealistic language. Many of its members, Apollo accepted, were in the mainframe market, and they were competitors. It was like herding cats, bogged down in politics. For instance, OSF had to start with IBM's AIX variant of Unix. This apparently was one of IBM's conditions for joining the coalition. So the whole thing turned out to be a true product-by-committee process. 2 years later, in 1989, OSF had an interesting user interface called Motif, but little else, and worsening economic conditions destabilized its member companies. The mainframe market was shrinking. HP ended up buying Apollo and was circling around Bull. DEC, IBM, and others were losing money in computers. By 1992, OSF had abandoned the big idealistic goal of releasing an AT&T free Unix OS. With the sponsors struggling to keep afloat, the organization eventually lost its funding and shriveled away. At least Sun managed to get Sun OS out during this period of time, and it turned out to be a pretty good product, and they adopted Motif too. By the late 1980s, BSD Unix no longer had commercial viability as an operating system, but BSD still had value. AT&T was raising the cost of its licensing fees. Back in 1979, a commercial license cost $20,000. By the end of the decade, those fees had climbed to a staggering $100,000. In 1993, they would be double that. Users wanting to build standalone TCP/IP products had to pay AT&T for a license for non-AT&T code, so they asked to split out BSD's networking code from the AT&T code. This was completed in 1989 as Networking Release 1, or Net 1. Keith Bostick at CRSG then pushed for a total purge of AT&T's copyrighted code. 18 months later, in 1991, work on what was called Networking Release 2, or Net 2 version of BSD had been completed. The team tried to identify everything they saw to be AT&T code and re-implemented it using what was called the clean room method. And they were largely successful, with the exception of 6 files in the kernel judged too difficult to do. Aware that they had something interesting, several former members of the CRSG broke off. In 1992, they founded a commercial entity called Berkeley Software Design Inc., or BSDI. With the university's permission, they started selling a new variant of Net2 BSD called 386 BSD, but with those 6 files added back in. All these names, my gosh. BSDI sold 386BSD at a 99% discount on USL Unix licenses, and they advertised it as a product that did substantially the same thing. The phone number on the ad was even 1-800-ITS-UNIX. AT&T obviously did not like that. They asked them to amend the marketing, which BSDI did. But AT&T, through its USL subsidiary, sued them anyway to halt the distribution. As is always the case, the trial dragged on and on. BSDI agreed that the 6 files were on them, but the other 16,000 or so files were already being distributed by Berkeley. What's the deal? The judge agreed and asked USL to amend the complaint. AT&T realized that 6 measly files would not make for a very strong case, so they refiled the lawsuit, but now they added the University of California, asking to halt the Net2 BSD distribution as well. Near the end of 1992, a judge heard the arguments. He denied the injunction and threw out all but 2 of the complaints. The University of California then filed a countersuit, arguing that AT&T had incorporated Berkeley's code into System 5 without proper credit. The lawsuit was highly covered in its time. Then in December 1992, AT&T sold the Unix subsidiary USL to Novell, a Utah-based software company. Novell had pioneered the local area network, or LAN, in the 1980s and wanted to integrate Unix into their NetWare network operating system. Ray Norda, Novell's co-founder and CEO, said that he would rather compete in the marketplace rather than the courtroom. USL and the University of California backed away from said courtroom, though a settlement wouldn't come until 1994, largely in Berkeley's favor. AT&T selling Unix to Novell put the first damper on the Unix wars, but the chaos had massive repercussions. I mentioned in an earlier video about Sun Microsystems that it allowed Windows NT to invade Unix's turf in workstations and higher computing. Released in late July 1993, Windows NT 3.1 offered a, quote, business-oriented, end quote, operating system, more high-powered than its traditional desktop computer OS. Many features were inspired by Unix, 32-bit, networking, file sharing for multi-user collaboration, and so on. Microsoft realized that what businesses and developers truly wanted was a consistent experience with Unix-like features, and that is what Microsoft produced for them. NT, combined with Microsoft's formidable marketing firepower, scared the industry into finally ending the Unix wars. In March 1993, members from both OSF and Unix International banded together to create the Common Open Software Environment, or COSE. COSE's goal was to finally build a common environment across the fractured Unix space. Novell handed the Unix brand to the organization running COSE, X-Open, so that compliant OS variants can receive the brand. Another beneficiary of the Unix wars was Linux, or GNU Linux. I know there is a naming controversy here, but I'm going to leave it aside. In the early 1980s, in response to AT&T's attempts to monetize Unix, an MIT professor named Richard Stallman started working on an operating system project called GNU. The goal was to create a package of truly free software compatible with a set of standards set up by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, POSIX working group. POSIX was a set of U.S. government-approved standards defining the APIs that all, quote, operating systems needed to be able to support. Anyway, over time, a lot of software for GNU was written except the kernel. The kernel is at the core of the operating system. It manages memory, processes, disk space, and more, so it is quite important. This kernel eventually came about through the efforts of a Finnish undergraduate named Linus Torvalds. He had been inspired by an educational Unix OS called Minix to write what eventually ended up being an operating system kernel. In 1991, he posted about it in the Minix newsgroup, and the combined project quickly gained contributors from that ecosystem. A year later, we have Linux. The Linux community's approach took some parts of Unix's way of operating. Volunteer contributors around the world working on a common code base, pushing changes. But Linux has a natural leader, its founder, Linus. This helped keep the community from fragmenting like Unix's did. With the founder acting as a curator of code changes, Linux was able to ship updates and fixes at a very rapid rate. Furthermore, Linux's source code was from the very beginning open to everyone, a true public utility. So you avoid another situation like when AT&T changed the terms of the deal and started aggressively monetizing the software. Thus, over time, Linux overtook Unix as the primary, quote, open operating system, particularly for scientific and technical applications. They made especially great gains in the 2 years when BDSI and AT&T have been embroiled in their courtroom drama. The Unix wars were wars of conquest. That conquest failed. I feel for AT&T's position here. They must have felt like they hit the jackpot. This thing that they thought they owned had turned into one of the core foundations of a thriving part of the computer industry. But their attempts to monetize Unix in these days is a reflection of that line Bill Gates reportedly said to Chamath back during their Facebook days. A platform is when the economic value of everybody that uses it exceeds the value of the company that creates it. Then it's a platform. Unix, the platform, made a lot of value for the community using it. AT&T, not unfairly, felt entitled to a larger share of that value as the creator of said platform. But in doing so, they would have to centralize and organize a delicate community of users. Those users had viable alternatives. When pressed, the community eventually fled to greener grass. Unix is still around, of course. The branches of Unix have famous descendants. Oracle Solaris, HP UX, FreeBSD, and OpenBSD are notables. And I should also mention the very popular macOS and iOS are very distant descendants via NeXTSTEP, which was an offshoot of 4.3 BSD, among others. If you want to see it that way, Unix's family exceeded everyone's expectations. But the story of the Unix wars leave many to wonder what could have been. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.